And we're live. Welcome to the Real Crusades History Podcast. We are back again for episode 3 of the First Crusade, our discussion of the First Crusade. And last time we talked about the Battle of Dorylaeum and the Siege of Nicaea before that. So this time we're going to be talking about the expedition into Cilicia and the final leg of the march across Anatolia, and also Baldwin of Bologna's expedition to take control of the Armenian city of Edessa. So some interesting stuff, maybe some stuff that gets a little bit sidelined often in discussions of the First Crusade, but we're going to see if we can give it a good treatment. So I'm J. Stephen Roberts. Also with me is Scott Amos. Scott, thanks again for being here. How are you, sir?
I'm doing good, Stephen. Always glad to be here.
Excellent. It's always good to have you on board.
Thanks.
And we're going to welcome back for the third time now. Our academic guest is Dr. William Hamblin, historian and medievalist. Dr. Hamblin, thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, it's very good to have you. So, after the Battle of Dorylaeum, the Seljuk Sultan of Rum, Kili Arslan, retreated and basically sought to avoid any further contact with the armies of the First Crusade. Meanwhile, the Crusaders themselves had to continue on their march across Anatolia, and Anatolia is incredibly arid and blisteringly hot at the time that they were going across it, and so it was a very difficult journey indeed. We do read in the primary source accounts of the deaths of many men and animals. The loss of horses and mules was very devastating. In particular, mules were very important for transporting supplies and equipment, so that was a huge problem. We often, I think, sometimes don't realize when we think about medieval armies how important mules actually were. Supplies weren't really transported on carts so often as we think. It was more these pack animals that were used to move equipment. So I'm going to go ahead and turn to you, Dr. Hamblin. Do you want to talk a little bit about kind of this last leg of the journey across Anatolia and sort of some of the things the Crusaders had to deal with?
Well, there was a kind of a big central chunk of Anatolia, or modern Turkey, is steppe country. It's not quite desert, but it's pretty bad. And so in the summer, lack of water, lack of fodder made serious problems for the Crusaders. Now, their foe, their enemy, was Cilician Arslan, the Turkish ruler of Rum. And we need to understand, basically, he doesn't fight the Crusaders again from Dorylaeum on. There's a number of reasons for this. Number one is that it was summer, it was hot, and he had exactly the same logistical problems that the Crusaders had. Perhaps worse, because Turkish armies were nomad armies and depended on horses. And in that period of the summer, finding enough fodder to collect enough horses to be able to fight the Crusaders was a big problem. He also had realized by this time that the Crusaders were heading to Jerusalem. They weren't attacking him. They were interested in passing through his country and going to Jerusalem. So as far as he was concerned, getting that army through, getting the Crusaders through as quickly as possible was to his benefit. And finally, we need to understand his army was not really destroyed, but we know that because a few years later he defeats the two armies of the Crusade of 1101. So he did have a strong enough army to face the Crusaders, but he basically decided to let them pass through. And for a lot of the journey, it was a terrible burden for the Crusaders. And what we find is there's a thing called attrition in military history, which means slow loss of military effectiveness. And that can come about from lots of different things. But going through Anatolia The attrition was caused by lack of water, and people died of thirst, lack of food, which would cause weakness and ultimately other types of illnesses that would be brought about by, you know, the increasing weakness. A lot of people were probably deserting. We know the desertion is described at several places along the crusading route, but there was probably just a bunch of low-level desertion going on as well. So the Crusader army is increasingly getting weaker and weaker as it passes through Anatolia, even without doing battle with the Seljuk Turks. Now, the Crusaders passed to a number of cities, and we need to understand that even though Anatolia, or much of Anatolia, was ruled by the Turks, most of the people at this time were still Christians. Lots of different ethnic groups, Armenians and Greeks and so forth, but they were largely Christian. Some Muslims had moved in, but not enough to shift the population balance yet, because the Turks had only been there for maybe 25, 30 years in these various cities. So a lot of the cities, even if they had a Turkish garrison, were a potential problem for the Turks, because the population might plot against them with the Crusaders. And in fact, that's how they finally take Antioch, which we'll discuss at another time, is through betrayal by an Armenian, not by actual military affair. So as the Crusaders passed, they passed through a number of cities, and those cities, the Turkish garrisons tend to flee because they don't have enough strength to oppose a city of the size of, or an army the size of the Crusaders, and therefore the population is able to feed them. So it is passing through cities where they get extra supplies, and then finally when they get down into what's called Pisidia, but it's south eastern central Anatolia, they start getting some areas where they could actually get some supplies from the surrounding countryside as well. But the key ingredient in their success was Kilij Arslan deciding not to fight them anymore, let them pass through, and the Christians of the cities they passed by being willing to supply them in various ways.
Yeah, thanks for that, Dr. Hamblin. So one of the main groups that the Crusaders are going to encounter in this area, this is a primarily Armenian area, and the local Armenians, they had never really been, of course, they didn't like being ruled over by the Turks, but also they weren't too keen on being ruled over by the Byzantines either. They seemed to be very willing to help out the Crusaders during this period, and there's going to be there's going to be really a long-term relationship between the forces of the Latin East, which is going to be established in the Crusader states, and this area of Anatolia, this kind of Armenian portion of the region. So
I think it's worth noting that a couple of things about the Armenians. Number one is their homeland is actually far off in northeastern Turkey, or where kind of Iran and Turkey meet. They were a very ancient people and had converted to Christianity in the 4th century, but they had developed their own independent Christian church, the Armenian Apostolic Church, which was different from the Greek Orthodox Church. And so there was some religious tension between the Armenians Christians and the Byzantine Christians. Now, some Armenians were Orthodox, but the population as a whole tended to have a different denomination. They also, in 1045, the Byzantines had conquered Armenia and basically taken its king Gagik II into captivity. And so from the Armenian perspective, the Byzantines were being essentially conquerors of these people, rather than allowing them to have an independent kingdom as they had had for a couple of centuries. So there was tension between Byzantines and Armenians, both over religious issues, theological disputes, which became cultural divides, and then also over the problem of the Byzantines essentially treating the Armenians like conquered peoples. Finally, we need to recognize that the Armenians were a militant society. That is to say, there were Coptic Christians and Syriac Christians, but they had basically been demilitarized through centuries of conquest and didn't have a military tradition where their people, were brought up learning how to fight and so forth. That the Armenians had been an independent kingdom for centuries and had a very strong martial tradition. And so the Armenians are the Eastern Christians who are most likely to stand up militarily, because the other groups basically had never, had abandoned any military tradition, largely because they'd been conquered by the Muslims for so long. You there?
Looks like.
Did we lose?
Where Stephen is, Dr. Hamblin. Well, let's continue. Oh, here he is back. You
Yeah.
there?
Well,
Sorry.
that's okay.
Everybody's still there?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. You were just finishing up talking about the Armenians.
Yeah,
Dr. Hamblin?
just kind of their background, and basically they had moved into the area around Cilicia and Antioch in the beginning in the middle of the 11th century, in response to Byzantine activities of intentional repopulation, and also because of Turkish invasion of their Armenian homeland. They migrate into the area where the Crusaders are going to encounter them. So they really had only been there in force for a generation or two by the time the Crusaders come.
Right. So, as you said, the Crusaders are going to pass through some of these cities. Pisidia is kind of the first one where they're able to really recuperate and recover from this traumatic journey across Anatolia. At Heraclea, the Crusaders face a choice in how they're going to advance into Syria. They've got two possible routes ahead of them. They've got southeast through this narrow defile of the Cilician Gates, and then across the fertile plain of Cilicia, and then over the Belen Pass, which is a natural break in the Amanus Mountains. And then that would take them into Antioch, and this is the shortest and most direct route. But the problem with this is there were going to be some Muslim garrisoned areas on that way, and they could potentially face some interruptions by Muslim forces. The other route was going to be through north through Cappadocia, and then east through the Anti-Taurus mountains, which is a large mountain range, and this is going to be the longer route. And this is actually the route that the main Crusader force is going to choose to take. However, interestingly, the Crusaders decide that they're going to send a couple of smaller expeditions along the shorter route. And for a long time, and these are going to be led by two individuals who are going to become quite important to the story of the First Crusade, and especially the development of the Crusader states. Godfrey of Bouillon's younger brother, Baldwin of Bologna, and Bohemon's nephew, Tancred. These two individuals are going to take a group each of a few hundred knights, and they're going to actually go through this shorter route through Cilicia. And for a long time, this was kind of believed to be like just kind of a plundering expedition, if you will, or just sort of a power grab by these two guys who were very ambitious personally, and were actually seeking to establish kingdoms for themselves. But there was a strategic reason for this. The point of this was to help the Crusaders establish allies and supply points in Cappadocia and Cilicia in preparation for this attack on Antioch. So there was some sound strategic reason for doing this. So yeah, this kind of brings us to the point where Baldwin of Bologna and Tancred kind of come to the forefront. They've sort of been hanging out in the background, sort of in the shadow of their more important relatives up until this point. But they're kind of interesting guys. So Baldwin of Bologna, of course, is the youngest of the three sons of Eustace II of Bologna, who's the Count of Bologna and was an ally of William the Conqueror. And so Baldwin's the youngest of these three sons. So he's Godfrey Bouillon's younger brother, and he originally had been intended for the church. So he had actually kind of a literary clerical education and had a knowledge of canon law. And this kind of was a characteristic that remained with him throughout his life, and was kind of affected his style of rule and his personality. But back when he was originally studying for the priesthood, he decided that the clerical life was not for him. He was a warrior in spirit, and so he opted to go ahead and live the life of a knight. And he kind of served as one of his brother's knights for a long time. But as we get into this period of the First Crusade, it does seem to be that Baldwin was interested in finding some lands for himself, establishing himself as a ruler in his own right somewhere. And that does seem to be kind of what he was thinking about with the First Crusade. And of course, he's going to play a major role in the establishment of the Crusader states, and we'll talk about that. Tancred, on the other hand, is the nephew of Bohemond of Taranto. So he's a Norman. He's a descendant of Robert Guiscard. He is the son of Bohemond's sister Emma, and he also is somebody who seems to be rather ambitious, interested in perhaps setting shop up somewhere, getting his own little kingdom going somewhere. So Baldwin and Tancred are going to set off on this journey into Cilicia. So, Dr. Hamblin, would you like to talk a little bit about what goes on with Baldwin and Tancred when they head off?
Sure. It's important to note before we discuss that younger brothers of noble families often had serious problems in the sense that they couldn't inherit the land. They had a smaller amount of wealth, and so they ended up being essentially servants or soldiers for their elder brothers. And so when they get a chance to go off and start their own little principality, they often did that. And that's not just true of crusaders like Baldwin and Tancred, who are both, suffer the younger brother syndrome, but lots of other people in the West, lots of Normans did it in southern Italy as well. So there are strategic reasons why they want to go into Cilicia, but there's also the goal for Tancred and Baldwin seem to have had a goal of establishing themselves in some sort of principality, not necessarily in Cilicia, but that is in the back of their mind as they're going on crusade here. Now, the other thing to note is that there's a big kind of semicircle of mountains surrounding Cilicia, and it's a flat plains that are fertile, and then the mountains that are very rugged. And the Armenians are controlling the mountains. They have mountain castles up there, and they're basically in charge there. But in the lower terrain, in the flatlands, the Turks seem to have garrisons in most of the cities. And these cities are largely Christian in population, both Greek and Armenian and others as well, Syriac as well. But they have Turkish garrisons that have been established there. And basically, the city as a whole is Christian, but there's several hundred Turks sitting in the citadel or in big towers who are watching over that city. The minute the Christians get a chance, they can rebel against those Turks. And so even with a small force of troops that Baldwin and Tancred come in with, troops numbering in the hundreds or maybe a couple thousand total for the whole group, they are still able to cause damage to these Turks because of the insecure situation that these Turks are facing. So they cross through a thing called the Cilician Gates, and it is a very difficult pass to cross. And that's one of the reasons probably why the main Crusader army decided to go around, because the larger your army is, the more difficult and longer it takes to get through this pass, because some of it's passable, but there's a section where it's very difficult. Tancred and Baldwin both go in there, and they don't seem to be coordinating very well. In part, it may be simply that each group decided to go in on their own, and they didn't coordinate together. Tancred makes it first to a place called Tarsus, where there is a Turkish garrison, and the Turks basically, they look at Tancred's army and they realize it's not very big, and they start out being willing to fight, but then they realize, they hear rumors and realize that more troops are coming. So they decide to surrender, and they let Tancred put his banner up on the city wall. And that basically means when a banner is on a city, that means the Lord whose banner that is owns that city. So the Turks had agreed to surrender, but the terms had not been fully agreed to nor implemented. And Baldwin then arrives with a larger force than Tancred has, several times larger. And the Turks basically shift and surrender the city to him. And that, of course, infuriates Baldwin, or Tancred rather, and it starts a feud between Tancred and Baldwin that's going to go on for certainly during the Cilician period, and then also causes trouble later on. So the population of Tarsus, largely Christian, Armenian, Syriac, and Greek, and when the Crusaders arrive, everybody accepts them in. We need to understand that Norman, or rather Frankish soldiers, mercenaries, had been serving in this region for a long time, and it wasn't unusual to have a Frankish garrison in these towns. Alexius and some of the other rivals, when they were fighting the Byzantine Civil War, all used Frankish mercenaries, and they'd say, okay, you 500 guys go over and garrison that city. So from the Armenian and Christian perspective, having Franks come in and garrison your town is not a big shift conceptually. It's not like they're conquering you. It's like, now these guys have been sent by the emperor to support us and free us. So their perspective is probably different than what Tancred and Baldwin are thinking of. You want me to keep going, or if you want to pick it up from there?
I have a question, Dr. Hamblin. Would these cities have been under, say, harsh Islamic rule, or was it kind of more of a cooperative situation?
Well, the Turks, when they establish dominance over a city, their fundamental goal is to get money and tribute from that city. Under Islamic law, there's a thing called the jizya, which is a head tax that each Christian had to pay to the Islamic government. So they would get that, but they probably also got additional tribute. And so their goal at this point, since the population is overwhelmingly Christian and you've only got a limited number of Muslims and a limited number of Turkish soldiers, their goal is not to persecute the people or cause trouble. Their goal is to get out as much money as you can from the Christian groups there.
I guess my question, were these people reduced to the status of dhimmitude, or was it kind of in between?
Yeah, no, they would, but what it means to be a dhimmi would vary from city to city, largely based on whether you had a very strict, like an imam or an Islamic leader who's very strict in applying these issues or not. But yes, they would, just as Muslims in the Byzantine Empire were considered second-class citizens, Christians in the Turkish lands and the Muslim lands were the same. So that was fairly normal within the context of medieval society, that there was the dominant group, be they Christians, Turkish, or whatever, and then there is the second-class group, like Jews in Europe or Christians in Islam or things like that. But so we do see lots of Turkish plundering and attacking and sacking places and massacring people. But once they get control of a town, they tend to say, we're going to get more money out of it through collecting the jizya or the head tax and through collecting tribute than we're going to get if we kill everybody, because once they're dead, there's no more money.
Mm-hmm.
So it just depends on the ruler, it depends on the situation, the political situation, and so forth. But at this time in this area, they're not pushing Islam because they don't have real good, solid control of the area.
Well, that's the impression I get, that their control was rather tenuous.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, that's a good point.
And which Turk is in control is also tenuous. That is to say, a Turk may be in charge, but there's a lot of these little princes or emirs who can be overthrown very easily, and another guy is going to get in charge. So it was unstable both in whether the Turks or the Christians ruled the town, and whether which particular Turk was in charge as well, or the Armenians in charge or the Byzantines in charge. So it was a very fluid, difficult, unstable situation into which the Crusaders thrust themselves. And in some ways they make it more unstable. And then eventually it does stabilize, but initially it's probably more unstable with them marching through.
Would you say by this phase of the campaign that the Franks' reputation preceded them?
Yes, we need to understand that the Frankish mercenaries had been serving in Byzantine armies for at least half a century and probably longer. And before that, there were groups known as the Varangian Guards, who were basically Norse or Germanic or English mercenaries who would go to Constantinople and form this elite guard unit. So, and if you read Anna, you can see this. The Byzantines viewed the Franks as kind of like an Englishman would view a Viking. They're kind of barbaric, but they're really strong, they're really tough, they're merciless, and they're great fighters. So Alexius and all the Byzantines were using Norman troops, and they were viewed as excellent fighters. The second element of this is the Crusaders are now marching through, and basically for the first time in several decades, we have victory over the Turks. The Turks have been kind of winning, you know, even with setbacks. They've been winning pretty consistently for 30 years, and now the Crusaders come on the scene, and suddenly they're seeing maybe the balance of power is shifting. And so the Crusaders are coming through with a reputation both from the past and in the current crusade as great fighters who you know, are the real thing in terms of military prowess.
But after Nicaea and then shortly after Dorylaeum, it would seem that, you know, a rather formidable, that would give them a rather formidable reputation right there.
Yeah, the Arab sources talk about them, but that is, talk about the prowess of the Crusaders, but they also kind of view them as barbarians.
Yeah.
So it's funny, each group thinks the other group is barbarian, right? I mean, so sure. It's kind of ethnocentricity that all people have this to some degree, and in the Middle Ages, they're, you know, if you don't have the right customs of sitting down to eat in the right way, you seem really weird, and, you know, you're kind of a barbarian. So, you know, everybody had their own eating customs, and if yours didn't fit, you'd be rude, right? And therefore you're a barbarian. So
okay, so basically at this point we've got you know, Baldwin has taken control of Tarsus, and Tancred pretty much decides he's just got to, you know, he's unhappy about it, but he has to continue on. Something interesting happens after that. A group of Normans show up at Tarsus. Some of Bohemond's men, who I guess, you know, were on their way to reinforce Tancred or something like that. But this group of Normans shows up, and Baldwin will not allow them to come inside of Tarsus. And his reason for that is because he's concerned that they might threaten his dominance in the city. And because of that, these guys basically camp outside overnight, and they are attacked by some local Turks, and they're all killed. And this actually creates a huge uproar in Tarsus. Baldwin's own men are very angry about it. They actually, grab any remaining Turks in the city they can find and kill them. And then we're also told that Baldwin actually locks himself in the citadel tower in fear, actually, of his own men. That they're upset that some fellow crusaders have sort of needlessly been killed because they weren't allowed into the city. Although eventually he's able to get control of the situation, and he's in control of Tarsus and his men again. But this is kind of an interesting episode. To me, it kind of points out something about Baldwin that maybe sort of foreshadows something about his personality as much as we can do with when we're looking at these medieval individuals. Baldwin was going to end up as king of Jerusalem, and he was going to be an incredibly effective king of Jerusalem. Not to jump ahead too far, but one of the reasons for that is he was kind of ruthlessly self-seeking in his insistence on his own authority and his own dominance within the kingdom, which was very different from how his brother ruled in Jerusalem. And that was kind of what the kingdom of Jerusalem needed because of its precarious situation. Now, I think we're almost seeing that aspect of Baldwin's personality. We're kind of seeing that show up here in this early phase. But in this situation, it's not really helpful because, this is more of a larger cooperative effort, if you will. And he's concerned about his authority being threatened in Tarsus. But anyway, what do you think of this episode, Dr. Hamblin?
Well, I think the first thing to note is that part of the problem was the Normans themselves, or who had come down, and they're required to camp outside the city. Now, notice Alexius, the emperor, had done the same thing to the Crusaders. He wouldn't let them in the city either. So letting in a bunch of armed men into a city is not necessarily a good idea. But when the Normans came down there, they thought, okay, we're at a city now that's held by the Christians, and apparently they didn't set up guards and they didn't protect their camp well. So in part, it's their own fault. And then in part, notice that the Turks they still have they still have a couple towers, or maybe the citadel or something at Tarsus, because there's Turks in the town still. They haven't all left. And then there's other Turks who have fled and are kind of wandering around outside. And the minute they see a chance to attack some Crusaders, they do it. The Turks tend not to want to engage in head-to-head battles. They like ambushes and sneak attacks and things like that. And that's what they do to these Normans. So on the one hand, you've got a little bit of problem that the Crusaders caused for themselves, the Normans did. On the other hand, Baldwin, there's this constant tension in the Crusades between ethnic groups against other ethnic groups, so like French versus Italians or whatever that might be, and then between one lord and a rival lord. And that tension, that essentially you have a lack of a single strong leader that can essentially order everybody else to do what needs to be done. And Adhemar can do that to some degree, but the lack of central leadership means that you get tensions between different Crusader groups over all sorts of issues. And we need to remember too that this was a honor-based society. That is to say, if your honor was threatened, it's worse than getting somebody hitting you, or it's just as bad. It's just as insulting. So you've got this honor issue as well. But basically, Baldwin was letting his own personal interests supersede the needs of the crusade as a whole. And he's not unique in doing this. Lots of people will do it on different occasions. Sometimes the Crusaders will kind of essentially say, I'm going to make this personal sacrifice for the good of the crusading movement as a whole. And other times they say, I need something, I need my honor, I need my power, I need my plunder, and will be rather more selfish in this. And when we see Baldwin go off to Edessa later, you can see he's thinking about his own honor and needs more than the Crusader movement as a whole to some degree. even though the Edessa affair turns out to be beneficial in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Baldwin, unlike some of these guys, Robert of Flanders or Robert Curthose or some of these guys, Baldwin clearly had an interest in organizing some kind of personal principality or something like that. And, that is actually going to be very important, because one of the problems with some later crusades is that there was nobody interested in that. People would show up and fight for a while, then go home. The First Crusade had quite a few people who were thinking, you know what, I'm going to go out to the east, I'm going to try to set something up, which was important if you're going to actually establish states. But
I think too, we should note that in Baldwin's mind, there's not necessarily a contradiction between God blessing him with a personal state and the success of the Crusader movement. We tend to think, well, they're either greedy plunderers or they're spiritual, completely spiritual in their goals, when in fact everybody in the Crusade was probably a mix of that, with sincere spirituality, sometimes winning out in their choices, and sometimes personal desires winning out. And so it's a complex mix in terms of the psychology and the spirituality of these crusaders.
And that's a really good point. And I think that we do often get that wrong. We think, oh, well, were these guys interested in setting up a prosperous kingdom, or were they spiritual? But it's like, no, there was a real strong sense that if they were successful, if they could establish a strong, prosperous kingdom, that actually was a sign of God's being happy with them. God was pleased with them. I mean, Fulcher of Chartres actually says that explicitly at the end of his chronicle, where he says, well, we've come out here and God has just blessed us with this success, and obviously he's happy with this, because look at all the wealth we've acquired and this magnificent kingdom we've established. It's blah blah blah. There's some element of he's attempting to lure more people out to the east with that too. But anyway, I did notice that it looks like Rand Brown is now with us. Rand, are you there?
Yep, I'm here.
Hey.
Hi.
Hello, Rand.
Gents, thanks for sorry for showing up late, but please don't stop on my account.
You might want to try to lower your sound level slightly if you can. I don't know if it's possible, but it's a little high pitched.
Yeah, well, welcome aboard, Rand. Glad to have you with us. We were just talking about Baldwin and Tancred's Cilician campaign and their little feud over Tarsus. So yeah, Tancred's going to continue on. He goes to a place called Adana in Cilicia. This place actually is under the control of an Armenian ruler, and apparently there had been a Turkish garrison there, but that garrison had fled, and now the Armenians were in control again. And this ruler in Adana offers Tancred some reinforcements. He gives him 200 Armenian troops, and they continue on for a city called Mamistra, which the Turks are in control of. And Tancred is able to take control of Mamistra and establish himself as the ruler of Mamistra. Baldwin shows up after that, and again, there's more tension between Baldwin and Tancred. So yeah, the Cilician campaign was overall quite successful in that the local Armenian population was very ingratiating to the Crusaders, and the Crusaders in their turn were able to establish good contacts with these Armenians. This was kind of the beginning of a long relationship between the Armenians and the Latins who were coming into the east. The royal family in the Kingdom of Jerusalem was essentially going to be half Armenian for quite a while. There's going to be a lot of intermarriage into these Armenian noble houses.
Same with Antioch.
Right, and Antioch as well. However, kind of as we've gone over, we see how the personal ambition of Tancred and Baldwin, while in one sense it's very useful in that they're going to be establishing roots here. Also, it can create some issues. You know, especially as we see the clash of these two sort of strong personalities of Baldwin and Tancred in this situation. So, does anybody have any further comments on the Cilician expedition? Dr. Hamlin, did you have anything else to add in your overview of it?
Well, I think the most important immediate effect was, that the Armenians in Cilicia are going to send supplies to the Crusaders during their siege of Antioch. And logistics are going to be one of the most difficult problems that the Crusaders face there, as we'll find out later. So in a sense, by the campaign in Cilicia, they increased their supplies during the later siege. The other thing I think to note is that the Armenians now see the Crusaders as allies, and so we'll have further Armenian adventures, especially with Baldwin in the east around Edessa and so forth, and that's going to facilitate that move. The future of Cilicia is that there are Armenian principalities that are struggling for independence. The Byzantine emperor comes along and says he thinks he should be the overlord of these Armenians in Cilicia. Now, why does he do that? Remember, the Crusaders had promised that all Byzantine cities would be returned to the emperor. So you get a tension between the Armenians, who want independence and create their own kingdom, and the Byzantines, who want lordship. And then the Armenians and Crusaders ally, but eventually they become, there's also tensions that develop between them. We should also note that the Armenians are, from their perspective, they're using the Crusaders just as much as the Crusaders are using the Armenians. That is to say, there are certain strategic goals the Armenians have, and largely it's defeat the Turks and retake these cities and establish our own principalities. And they're using, from their view, Crusaders are an army sent by the emperor to liberate them and restore them to predominance, not that the Crusaders are coming in to take over and set up their own independent kingdom. So they probably didn't fully conceptualize how it turns out that the Crusaders create a new kingdom rather than simply freeing the Armenians to be independent or return to Byzantine rule. So that's another thing to think about.
Yeah, I think, you know, we look at how these different groups were sort of vying for their own political independence or dominance. But I also think we do need to keep in mind, too, there was definitely the fact that they were both Christian, like the Latins were Christians, the Armenians were Christians, that did create a kind of instant bond or an instant rapport. You know, when the Crusaders show up, the Armenians are very willing to help them because they don't want to have Muslims ruling over them. They don't want to be under the control of the Turks.
Yeah, absolutely. The fact that Byzantines, Armenians, and Crusaders are all Christians is the core element that binds the alliance together. There's lots of tensions that can tear that apart, but that's kind of the central factor. We do find sometimes Muslims and Crusaders ally together and fight other Crusaders or other Muslims. So, you know, it can transcend that, but that's still the core of what's keeping the whole East as a, geopolitical system. It's the shared Christianity.
Yeah, that's true. I do think that if we look at the way that Crusaders and Muslims would ally with each other, it's a far more superficial.
Right, and it lasts for one specific circumstance and then it breaks up.
Right. It's not like where we see, you know, these Crusaders are taking Armenian wives. You know, they're even adopting elements of the Armenian religious observances. Like, that's one interesting thing about the Latin East, is there's going to be a lot of Eastern flavor to even the religious practices. You know, we look at a queen like Melisande, for example, who she's half Armenian. She's half Armenian, half Latin. We do know we have her prayer, one of her prayer, they call it Psalter, I believe it is.
Yeah.
And that is like a very interesting synchronistic example of these Latin practices and these Orthodox practices. So it's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, if you are a princess like Melisenda, and your mom prays in a certain way with a certain priest, you know, in a certain language, you're going to pick that up as you develop into adulthood, just as much as you'll pick up your father's Latin practices. And so, you know, it's a natural thing for these children of mixed marriages to adopt a lot of the practices of their mother and beliefs and culture, and then a lot of their father as well. And you get this then synthesis.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, meanwhile, the main army of the Crusade is forging ahead on this longer route. They go north to Caesarea and Cappadocia, and then southeast to arrive in Coxon in the first week of October. The Turkish garrisons flee in their wake. More good relations are established with local Armenians. And there's actually some Byzantine garrisons established in some of these towns as well. So kind of in keeping with the promise they had made to Alexius. The journey over the Anti-Taurus mountains towards Antioch is incredibly difficult. That's something we get from the sources. These are very high mountains. It's very easy for people to fall over, and you know, people and animals fall to their deaths and that sort of thing. So does anybody have any comments about this portion of the Crusade or anything we've talked about so far? Scott, Rand, or Dr. Hamblin?
No, other than you know, and hopefully you all can hear me okay.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that particular region of the world is very, the terrain is very in certain places is very inhospitable, and it's very prohibitive. It's not the easiest place to move armies around. That's something you'll see multiple times, not only through the Crusades, but even later on when the Mongols messing around down there and things like that. So it's it was a very impressive feat militarily that you know, especially Baldwin was able to pull this off. And I think it says a lot to the skill and the professionalism of the you know, of the majority of the men of the First Crusade, that they even succeeded in this particular venture.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So in October of 1097, the Crusaders are going to reach this Armenian town of Marash. Once again, it's kind of the same thing. The Muslim garrison flees ahead of them, and the Armenians provide them with supplies. This is actually where Baldwin of Bologna is going to rejoin the main army. He rejoins the main army at Marash in October of 1097. When he arrives there, he finds his wife, Godvera, is dying. She's going to die that month. At this point, Baldwin approaches his brother Godfrey about this idea to press on into Mesopotamia ahead of the main army and establish, you know, possibly try to establish a Frankish state there. He's got one of his Armenian allies is this guy named Bagrat, who has been telling him about the possibility of going out to Mesopotamia and making something happen. Godfrey is going to agree to this. Baldwin is going to get a few hundred guys, and he's going to head out to Mesopotamia. His departure actually is going to be October 17th of 1097. That's when he's going to actually set out. So, Dr. Hamblin, did you want to talk a little bit about what happens with Baldwin when he heads out to Mesopotamia?
Right. Bagrat was the brother of a guy named Kog Vassal, who was one of the Armenian barons. The Armenians were able to control several castles and cities in the area, and they had an ongoing struggle with the Turks. So Bagrat's goal is to get Baldwin to come out, essentially viewing him as a mercenary who will support and strengthen the Armenian kingdoms of that area, whereas Baldwin's goal is more to establish his own state. We need to understand that from 1071 until 1090, there was an Armenian kingdom there in this area under a guy named Philaretos Brachamios, also in Zvahram in Armenian. And he actually, after the Battle of Manzikert, he was the general in command of the Antioch area, and he set up military defenses mainly of Edessa and Antioch. He was in charge of that area. He had 8,000 Frankish mercenaries who were serving for him, who were kind of proto-crusaders. Like I said, there's lots of Normans and Franks running around there. And he essentially declares himself emperor at one point during the civil wars, but he establishes this Armenian kingdom. But the Seljuk Turks attack him and take Antioch from him in 1084 and Edessa in 1087. So these, before the Crusaders come on the scene, these cities have only been in the hands of the Turks for a decade or so. When Philaretos dies in 1090, his state breaks up into a whole bunch of small principalities. There's nobody to succeed him, and all of his generals, each one who's in charge of a different city, essentially becomes independent. So Baldwin is moving into this situation where you have a bunch of rival Armenian lords who are seriously threatened by the Turks, and they know they're not going to make it in the long run if they don't get help. So Baldwin is moving in there. The Armenians want help against the Turks, and they think he's going to provide that. He does help along the way, but he basically heads for Edessa. And in Edessa, there's a man named Thoros, who's an Armenian who's in charge of the city. And Thoros adopts Baldwin as his son because he doesn't have any heir, and his goal in having Baldwin come is essentially to have a mercenary force to help against the Turks, especially the Turks of Samosata, who have been causing lots of trouble for him. But there's a problem that Thoros is a Greek Orthodox Armenian. That is to say, he's Armenian ethnically, but Greek Orthodox in religion, whereas almost all of his people are Armenian Apostolic. And so there's a lot of tension there. And then also he seems to have been kind of a tyrant. So in the end, the people decide they'd prefer to have Baldwin rather than Thoros, and they murder him, possibly with the collusion of Baldwin as well, and set him up as their ruler. Now remember, only 10 years ago, they were Frankish mercenaries running the garrison of Edessa under this Armenian general Philaretos. So for them, it's not a huge transition to having a bunch of Franks serving as the army to defend your city. That had been going on for a while. But that means that Baldwin is able to establish the first Crusader state based at Edessa, and then in the following months, he kind of expands out a little bit, taking other places around some castles and starts expanding his little kingdom. Not many Frankish soldiers there, but he is able to gain a lot of Armenian troops to come and support him in that as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. And early on, when Baldwin first shows up at Edessa, actually, this Thoros guy, he kind of tries to treat Baldwin like a mercenary at first. He offers him gold and, sort of tries to say, hey, look, I'll supply you with all this booty and stuff, and, you can kind of be my fighting man. And Baldwin sort of says, well, no, I'm really not interested in that, and I'm interested in some kind of role in ruling this area. And so that's at the point when Thoros decides to adopt Baldwin as his son, and they do this kind of interesting ritual where they both strip down to the waist and they press their chests together and then put a larger shirt on over them to symbolize their this is one of the kind of classic moments from this whole story, but it's just kind of an interesting image. You gotta imagine what this must look like. But
very reminiscent of if you've ever seen the movie with gosh, what's his name? The would-be king, Yeah. It's very like, oh wow, we've just found this very, very unusual culture. and we're just roll with it.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of Stephen Runciman, but his description of that is very, very colorful. He kind of like embellishes it. He says, like, imagine this big hairy Frank pressing this little Armenian guy up against his chest. Whatever. But yeah. So this is what happens, and before Baldwin even gets to Edessa, he actually captures a couple of fortresses. He takes Ravendell and Turbicel, which are both going to become important parts of the county of Edessa. So his reputation kind of precedes him, you know, as he gets to Edessa. And apparently there's an enthusiasm from the sort of the population in Edessa that, you know, finally maybe we've got somebody who can actually protect us from the Turks. And like you said, Dr. Hamblin, there was this guy, this Turk named Baldric of Samosata, who was a huge problem for the Edessans. He was frequently raiding them. And that's one of the first things Baldwin's going to do is he actually checks the Turkish, this Turkish lord Baldric. He builds a castle close to Samosata that sort of prevents you know, this constant raiding, and then not long after that, he's actually going to capture Samosata itself and make it part of the county of Edessa. So Baldwin, you know, he already is sort of showing himself to be, you know, this capable politician, this capable military leader. That he's really going to show himself to be once he becomes king of Jerusalem. But yeah, any further comments from anybody about Baldwin's little venture into Edessa here?
I mean, I think it just demonstrates just how adept he was at maneuvering a very complex and probably to them very alien landscape. You know, especially culturally. So it would have been interesting to kind of be a fly on the wall, you know, during all this, and just to see the sort of the, you know, the not to use a much abused phrase, but the, you know, sort of winning hearts and minds phase, you know, of the Crusades, you know, but yeah, you know, and at the same time, the Armenians are trying to figure the Franks out too. You know, I think they, you know, like you said in the beginning, I think they just kind of thought these were, you know, these were just more mercenaries, probably in the service of the Byzantines, and then I think it kind of slowly started dawning on them that, like, no, this is different. Like I think these guys are kind of here to stay, you know, and then just to see that, you know, shift occur, but you know, and it's you know, it'll become a little bit more problematic as you know, I'm sure we'll discuss later, but at the same time, the other thing is, I think it shows that, contrary to very popular modern misconception about the you know, the sorts of men who went on crusade, and really just, you know, medieval Westerners in general, Baldwin, because of his background, because he was originally, and I don't know if y'all discussed this at all, but, you know, because he was originally trained as a cleric in his early life, he was probably very well educated, probably even compared to a lot of his fellow Crusader leaders. He was probably very literate.
Yeah.
He probably at least knew Latin and Greek. You know, because those were the academic standards of their day, and so he probably had a fairly decent, you know, he probably had a very quick wit, you know, with him, and a you know, very sharp intellect going into this kind of a situation. So you know, I think really it does just kind of speak to some of the personal qualities of the man who would later become Baldwin I of Jerusalem.
He was a very pragmatic guy in terms of his attitude about the local Christians too. Like, once he becomes king of Jerusalem, he always ensured that the local Christian groups, the local Orthodox groups, had full access to the Holy Sepulchre and that kind of thing. And he never would, like, you know, the Latin clergy sometimes wanted him to maybe oppress some of the local practices. He would never do that. And that's kind of what he does here in the county of Edessa. He really ingratiates himself with the Armenian population. He marries an Armenian woman. He uses Armenians as knights. He uses them as administrators, as advisors, and which obviously he had to do that. I mean, like Dr. Hamill is saying, he had very few men with him. This could not have been done unless he really became, you know, immersed into some of these already present Armenian institutions.
Yeah. And I think the fact that, in a sense, this was an education for him in how to rule the kingdom as a whole, because he comes on the scene having seen what was successful at Edessa and can transfer that to the kingdom as a whole in part. So you know, some of the Crusaders were not very enthusiastic about the Eastern Christians, but others like Baldwin were able to interact with them and get along with them. So,
yeah, the Principality of Antioch tended to be rather oppressive towards some of the local Christian populations. That was something that Baldwin would never allow. So, and I don't think he was necessarily a sentimental guy or anything. He was just incredibly pragmatic and as a ruler, and he did what worked. So anyway, so that's Baldwin of Bologna, now Baldwin the First of Edessa. That's his adventure into Edessa. One of my favorite parts of the First Crusade, quite frankly, just because I love Baldwin the First of Jerusalem. I think he's just a fantastic figure from this period. So, okay, that's kind of wrapping up what we were planning on doing with this particular podcast. I know we talked about possibly laying the groundwork a bit for the Siege of Antioch, but I think we've probably done enough. Does anybody else want to say anything? I mean, if somebody wants to start talking about the Siege of Antioch, that's perfectly fine with me. But what do you guys think?
Well, I think the biggest thing to take from, at least in the short term, to take from Baldwin's Edessa campaign is that because he establishes himself out there really before the Siege of Antioch really gets underway, or as it is getting underway, ends up, unknowingly, of course, before it happened, he ends up being probably one of the most fortuitous factors of the Crusader success at Antioch, because during the siege, he because he's in such he holds the extremely fertile lands of Edessa and the resources that they provide, and because he's made such good relationships, he's forged such strong relationships with the local Armenians. The Crusaders end up having access to quite a bit of logistic support that they wouldn't have otherwise had. And of course, sieges in medieval warfare were extremely expensive from a logistics standpoint, extremely demanding. And what ends up becoming even more, I know I'm probably giving some teasers out for the next podcast, but Baldwin's presence out in Edessa becomes a very critical strategic benefit when the second phase of Antioch occurs, and Kerboga of Mosul with his extremely impressive army begins moving towards Antioch, and basically Baldwin's presence out there serves as a very fortuitous distraction to Kerboga, and buys the rest of the Crusaders in Antioch a lot more time than they would have gotten had he not been out there. So it really was an extremely beneficial. The benefits it reaped were substantial for the Crusader cause over in Antioch.
Yeah, excellent points, Rand. I believe I read somewhere, I'm not sure if this is accurate or not, but that in fact Baldwin's possession of Edessa and his ability to provide supplies at Antioch actually had a lot to do with allowing Godfrey to kind of sort of rise above some of the other leaders and become kind of a major factor at Antioch and from then on. I'm not sure if that's true or not. Does anybody have any thoughts on that? Or
I think the issue was that Baldwin had become essentially a major prince through this, and he hadn't been before. And now it's like you have two guys supporting Godfrey rather than just Godfrey as one faction versus the other princes. So in a sense, it's like he gets an extra vote at the Senate or something by having Baldwin now as a prince as opposed to just my little brother.
Yeah, he's definitely got a seat at the big table now after this.
The paradox of all this is that in the long run, Edessa probably is a drain on Crusader strength, because they spent a lot of effort trying to save it, and it's quite vulnerable out there, especially when you get Zengi coming on the scene. So initially there's some benefit, but in the long run, I think it also causes a lot of strategic problems for the Crusaders, because it really is just kind of out in the middle of Muslim territory.
Yeah.
And far from the coast, so you can't get any of the naval coastal support that the other Crusaders do.
Well, for the first period of Edessa's life, what really holds it together is that it has a couple of really strong leaders, Baldwin II and Jocelyn. Jocelyn in particular, Jocelyn is kind of a really noteworthy figure in history of the Crusades. And yeah, it's like once that is gone, like once Jocelyn II comes on, and he's a rather weak personality, it's kind of over for Edessa. So there's that. Okay, well, it sounds like everybody's kind of said what they want to say for this particular podcast. And, it looks like we're going to be having more episodes for this than we initially thought, and I'm perfectly fine with that. I think that'll be a lot of fun. The next episode is going to be episode 4, and that is going to be about the siege of Antioch itself. So that should be pretty exciting. So I guess
sounds great.
Good. Excellent. So just one last chance. Does anybody have anything else to add before I kind of close us out here?
Well, yes. Now, Tancred had gone on to join the main armies moving toward Antioch at this time, correct?
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like basically those cities were left with garrisons, and Tancred just rejoins the main army.
There's one other element of that, and that is Tancred takes Alexandretta, which is the most important city of the Crusades, because that's where Indiana Jones of the Last Crusade was launched from. But
that is huge.
In a more immediate sense, the conquest of Alexandretta provides a sea link between the Crusaders and Antioch, and later they'll get another one at St. Simon's, the ports. And so in the immediate sense, that sea link becomes really important for the Crusaders during their siege of Antioch. We'll discuss that later. So as Tancred's coming into the army, he also adds that conquest, which is very helpful.
Well, Tancred had done a similar thing on a smaller scale, but he chose to rejoin the main armies rather than remain behind like Baldwin. So I don't know, how does that speak to his persona or ambitions or whatever? I mean, he had made a similar place for himself.
Well, would the difference maybe be that there was still a lot of work to be done out at Edessa? I mean, the territory that had sort of been consolidated in Cilicia was fairly was kind of stable, more so. Is that correct, or am I kind of?
Well, I think Edessa was one of the major cities of the Middle East and had a huge and powerful fortification. And so to get that gives you a principality. Mymistra's a mid-level city. And
That's
so it's just simply not as viable a state as Edessa would have been.
Yeah.
So you don't know if Tancred was planning to go back or not, but at this point he presses on.
But he wasn't content just to become Prince of Mymistra and stay and establish his own. I mean, if he had, motives, kind of mixed motives, he wasn't content with that.
I think that's right, and I think he realized it wasn't viable with the number of troops he had, so eventually he presses on. Bohemond may have sent a note saying, we need you here, come help, but there's no evidence of that, but it's possible that type of thing might have happened too.
And then, we can throw the religious motive in there too. I mean, a lot of these guys wanted to make it to Jerusalem to kind of complete that vow. And the Gesta Tancredi certainly says that was important to Tancred. Now, like Dr. Hamlin was talking about last time, it is kind of a, sort of like the genre of medieval biography where the subject is just, there's lavish praise heaped on the subject, but that's something that is mentioned in the Gesta Tancredi, that Tancred, he wanted to get to Jerusalem. So.
Yeah, well, even crusaders who stay in the north and garrison some of these towns like Bohemond and Baldwin, they do go on to Jerusalem and perform the pilgrimage, even if politically and militarily they're based in the north. So everybody on crusade, they had to get to Jerusalem. That was the vow. It wasn't conquer the east. It was go to Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. All right. Well, sounds like we've kind of wrapped things up nicely here. So that is episode 3. We have covered the Cilician expedition and Baldwin's establishment of the county of Edessa. So I think that was some good work, gentlemen. I'm going to go ahead and say thanks to the panel. Scott, thanks for being here.
Sure. Always glad to be here with you guys.
And Rand, I'm glad you got to join us in the middle there. Certainly glad to have you.
Absolutely. Thanks for the opportunity.
And on behalf of all 3 of us, I just want to say thanks to Dr. Hamblin. Dr. Hamblin, it's really great to have you and have your expertise on these podcasts. We're so glad you can join us.
Well, thanks for having me.
Good. And Dr. Hamblin has a really good website called crusadingwarfare.net. And he's also releasing a good series of YouTube videos about the military history of the Crusades on his YouTube channel, which is also called Crusading Warfare. And there will be some links to that in the information box for this podcast. So what are you working on currently with your YouTube channel, Dr. Hamblin?
Well, I've managed to get the Crusaders to Constantinople, and so I'm going to be looking at Nicaea and Dorylaeum in the next few weeks. Yeah.
Really good stuff. Really good channel. And also, I forgot to mention last time, but Scott Amos has a really good novel out that's set during the period of the First Crusade called To Shine with Honor. And that is available on Amazon. And the link for that will also be in the info box. And Scott,
I've read that. I've read it. It's very nice. So good job.
Oh, you read the book?
Yeah, the novel.
You've read To Shine with Honor?
Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yeah, I enjoyed it.
Well, thanks very much.
Yeah, some really good work you did there, Scott. And
well, I'm working on the sequel. It's a trilogy, and I'm agonizing my way through Nicaea right now, and it's an agonizing piece of writing. But yes, it's all essentially written, but it's gone through some critiques, and I'm working my way through those now. So it'll be along pretty soon. I'm really glad to hear you enjoyed it, Dr. Hamblin.
Well, thanks. Yeah, it was nice. Lots of fun.
Yeah, you did a great job on that, Scott. And I can empathize with you too, because I'm actually working on a book right now myself about the Third Crusade, and it's writing novels it's a lot of fun, but writing historical novels it really you really want to get that historical accuracy. So you do. You're compelled to just to make the research so deep. So
not if you work for Hollywood.
That's fair.
Yeah. If you want to get on with Ridley Scott or whatever. Well, and we have to mention your novel as well, Stephen, and Helena's.
Yeah, I was bringing up yours specifically because it's First Crusade oriented, whereas mine is kind of like 1120s Kingdom of Jerusalem.
Right.
So when we do our podcast about that, I'll be.
Mine is First Crusade intensive.
Mine does have a lot of Armenians in it, though. So.
Well.
So anyway, great job, guys. We'll be back this same time next Tuesday. 7 p.m. U.S. Central Time, wherever that is, wherever you are, for episode 4 of this. So it's a lot of fun. This is Real Crusades History. You can find us at realcrusadeshistory.com, and we do release something new every Monday, either a video or podcast. And currently, we're doing a new podcast every Tuesday as well. So I'm going to go ahead and say over and out. We'll talk to everybody next time.